What's up, everybody? Che here with the No Spoon Podcast. Welcome to the YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so now. But I really want you to stick around, stay around to the end, like this video or dislike it, whatever you so choose. Comment, um, share it with people. I want to get this conversation going because I want to hear what you have to say about this. This is a rather controversial topic, and I'm going to touch on it. And I'm probably going to say some things that are going to offend you, some things that you're probably going to disagree with, and some things that you're going to hopefully, and that's my main point, is to shed light on some things and see things from a new perspective, right? So there's a viral video going around of Pastor John MacArthur of Grace Community Church here in LA. And he is addressing mental health issues. He's addressing a lot of the things that are going on as far as people and their issues that they deal with and they have to deal with on a mental health level every single day. So I want to play the video real quick, let you see the clip, and then I'm going to go ahead and comment about it.
There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies to basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people. And Big Pharma is in charge of a lot of that. If you understand, take PTSD, for example. What that really is grief. You are fighting a war, you lost your buddies, you have a certain amount of survival guilt because you made it back, they didn't. How do you deal with the grief? Grief is a real thing, but grief is part of life. And if you can't navigate grief, you can't live life. But if you clinically define that, you can give them a pill, a series of medications, and they end up in LA homeless on the sidewalk. This is in regard to children, it's the most deadly thing that's been unleashed on children, medication. We're trying to make clear to parents that behavior is essentially the result of choices that kids make. And if you parent them properly, they'll make right choices. But if you blame it on something other than their choices, and you identify them as having something they can't do anything about, but medicate it, you literally are turning your child into a potential, not only a potential drug addict, but maybe a potential criminal, because they never learn how to navigate life in a socially acceptable way.
So you can see why that can be controversial, and that is controversial. And I've seen this video go all over Twitter, and it has been a lot of people agreeing with them, and some people not agreeing with them. I mean, it's kind of split, I would say. I think there's more people disagreeing with him than there are agreeing with him. Even on my page, on the Instagram page, it seemed like there was more comments made towards disagreeing with him, and I can understand why, and I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit. So as you see, he's talking about like some pretty serious topics, right? PTSD, OCD, ADHD, and he says, and he makes a pretty bold claim in today's world that none of those things are real, right? And he kind of gives his own synopsis that, we are not addressing these things properly, and instead we're putting labels on things that aren't really things, and it's the benefit of big pharma and the healthcare providers and so on and so forth, right? And I agree with that 100%. I agree with that 100%. Like I truly believe that there is beneficiaries to all of this, and you just have to look to see where the money goes. And pharmaceuticals are where the money goes. Healthcare providers are where the money goes. Academia is where the money goes. I mean, the people that are running big pharma and these healthcare providers, they're coming from academia. The researchers that are doing the research that's validating these things are coming from academia. So a lot of it is true. Now, as far as the claim that, and I'll get back to that a little bit later, but as far as the claim that these things aren't real, I think that needs to be addressed and modified in what he's actually saying. So here's how I see this, right? PTSD, right, is post traumatic stress disorder, which means that a traumatic event happens, and afterwards, the stress from that traumatic event lingers and it leads to a disorder in the individual. So, for example, a person could have been abused, let's say as a child, right? A person is abused, that's a traumatic event, that's trauma, right? And that trauma leads to stress post the event, and then that stress leads to the disorder. So what we have is the event, we have the stress, and then we have the disorder, right? So PTSD is a real thing, right? I believe it's real. It really happens. People really experience it, right? But we have to kind of walk it back to kind of to understand why it comes about. And I think that when we do that, we can then better understand what he's saying here. So here's the thing: trauma is subjective. So one person's trauma is not going to be the same as the next person, right? Some people can have some very, very terrible things happen to them and move on from it. Some people can have some things that we would look at as being, menial, and it lingers forever. I think the thing is that we have to look at not the trauma, but the response. And then when we look at the response, then we have to then say that that's where the key into solving the problem is. So if we just assume that something traumatic happens is going to lead to disorder, then we are taking out that culpability on the individual. Now you're going to say, well, we can't blame the victim. Let's say a person was abused, and we can't blame the victim for what happened to them because they had no say so in that. They were a victim. Like a child being abused is a victim. They were in a vulnerable situation, in a vulnerable state in their lives, and they were taken advantage of by somebody that was older and had more of the wherewithal to know what they were doing and did it maliciously, right? So you would look at that and say, that sounds like you're blaming the child. Yes and no, right? You're not blaming them for the event that took place. However, the responsibility is on them on how they choose to respond to it. Now, again, some trauma is going to be harder to choose to respond in a positive manner. Other trauma is going to be less harder, less difficult, right? However, it doesn't take away from the fact that you have the choice on how you respond to it, right? I think that that's what he's talking about there, is that we can make the conscious decision to go down a positive path, or we can make the conscious decision to go down the negative path. And when it comes to the industry of psychiatry, psychology, academia, big pharma, they want you to go down the path that's negative because they benefit from it. So what we're seeing a lot of the times now are things happening to people that are now being labeled trauma. And in reality, they're not really trauma. They are just things that happen, right? You have people who are sending their kids to therapy over the death of a pet, a death of grandma and grandpa. And I was just watching the episode of Joe Rogan with Abigail Shrier, and she was talking about how therapy is actually hurting kids, especially therapy for kids. And she gave those type of examples of, yes, people are sending their kids to therapy when they don't really need therapy. At 6 years old, because their parents went through a divorce, they're going to therapy. Now, can divorce be traumatic? Of course they can. But is the child showing the disorder? Are they showing the stress? Are they even aware and cognizant of what's going on to even be stressed about it? And then what happens is you sit them in front of a professional, quote unquote, that wants to talk them through their problems, and a lot of times what they're doing is introducing their problems. So a child may not even understand that, oh wow, this is traumatic. I'm supposed to be upset. I'm supposed to be grieving. I'm supposed to be having a disorder, and I don't have the disorder. Now you've introduced the disorder, so now I have a disorder. You see how that works? So that's some of the things that I see that's going on, is like we're seeing a lot of times that these so-called professionals are introducing ideas, and then these ideas are taking root. Now here's the problem that I think that comes with all of this, right? Is that once you introduce the idea to the individual that has gone through the trauma, right? That individual then learns that they can use it to their benefit. Here's the thing that I think that is a really, really big problem. Um, and I've seen this personally, being incarcerated, uh, being around people who have dealt with some of the most worst trauma you can deal with, being around drug addicts and drug dealers and gang members and criminals and everything that you can possibly imagine that I've been around, and been through recovery programs myself, gone through AA, gone through NA, um, gone through a lot of these different programs, and now working with people that are in recovery. I see that a lot of times people, they don't actually want to solve the problem, right? And so I think that's why a lot of people got triggered by what he said, because it exposes them. What happens is that once you introduce something, once you label something and you say, well, you have anxiety or you have depression, right? Those can be real things, and they're real things because we choose to respond to something in a negative manner, right? And then it leads down a path to depression or anxiety or PTSD, which is the whole point of all this, is that we need to focus on that part that we can choose, where we have the choice, right? But once we understand that now we have an issue, then we can then understand that that issue can then become advantageous to us. So for example, they were talking about, when I was watching the interview with Schreier on the Joe Rogan show, she was talking about how kids these days are given anytime passes in school. Some places are implementing this. This is when a child or student feels like that they are being overwhelmed and they need to take a mental health break, and they can use that pass to get out of class and go kind of refocus and recenter their thoughts, or so on and so forth. It's even happening in the corporate world, where people are taking mental health days where they have to just get their mental health right. Now you say, well, people do have issues, okay, but there's a lot of people that don't. And do you really have an issue, or are you really manipulating the issue so that you can get out of doing certain things and get out of responsibility? And then what I see with people is people will use these ailments as a manner of uh, getting their way, so to speak. Just put it to you in the simplest way. They get their way. So, for example, you have a person who may be suffering from depression, and they may be quote unquote suicidal. And I say quote unquote because, you know, again, it becomes a tactic almost. And I'm not saying this for everybody, but I've seen it happen over and over and over again, where people will utilize their condition to get their way. So you can have an individual who says, you might disagree with them. You might want to correct them on something. You might see them doing something wrong. You might see that their way is wrong. And then what do? You're triggering my anxiety. You're triggering my depression. You're being combative. When in reality, all you're doing is correcting. All you're doing is bringing a counter argument to their argument, right? And so what they learn is that if I can, then once somebody disagrees with me or I don't get my way, I go into this reclusive, depressive state. I start having an attitude and bringing negative energy around people. And then, or even to the extreme where I start saying that I'm suicidal. I start doing things to hurt myself that's not really committing suicide, but it's getting the attention that I want. Then what people start to do is they start to walk on eggshells around you. They start to then say, just give them their way so that we don't have to deal with all that. They start to manipulate the conditions that they've been given. So I don't think I truly believe that there's a lot of people suffering, quote unquote, again, from these ailments, or have been diagnosed with these ailments, and they don't want to get better. It's like addicts. I've seen addicts who don't want to get better. And you say, well, they go to AA, they go to NA, they're constantly in these programs and so on and so on and so forth. And I said, yeah, but they benefit from this. They benefit from being the victim. They benefit from saying, I have a condition that I can't control. You have to then cater to my condition. And in reality is, if we take a step back, most of these conditions we can control. We can control how you respond to trauma. And one of the things that we can do in order to respond in a more positive manner is come to the realization, and this is just factual, that trauma and adversity and things that are bad are going to happen to you. Life is just like that. So what we need to do is develop resilience so that we can overcome the trauma, and we don't allow the trauma to dictate what we're doing in the present day. That's the problem. We allow the trauma of yesterday to dictate how we move today, which then dictates the future. So what is still controlling us, what is still governing us, is that traumatic event. So even if to the extreme cases you were abused, let's say as a child, well, your abuser still has power and control over you, because you are allowing that trauma that they've inflicted upon you to influence how you move today. And I know it's not an easy solution. I know it's not something that, just get over it. That's not how it works, obviously. But we can't allow ourselves to get into this mind state that those states of minds, that mental state is permanent, right? That anxiety is permanent. That the stress from the trauma and the disorder that leads to it is a permanent thing, that you can overcome it, that you can push through it. Now, when it comes to things like he said, ADHD and OCD, I think that's a different topic, but it's kind of the same thing, right? It is kind of the same thing because you can control it. However, I think that a lot of things diet-wise, and how we're consuming so much sugar at a young age, and we're becoming people that are constantly addicted to the dopamine that comes from sugar, which then leads to the dopamine that comes from drugs and alcohol and other substances and stuff like that, that it does lead to these disorders. And these disorders are real. But the reality is that we choose the diets that we eat. We choose the exercise that we do or don't do, right? We choose a lot of these things, and that's the whole point of all this, man. When you look at this, is PTSD real? Is OCD real? Is ADHD real? Is depression real? Is anxiety real? Are all of these things real? I think they're real if you allow them to be real. And that's what it comes down to. And so they don't want you to know that, for one, because they don't benefit from it. And I seen I just talked about who they was, the people that benefit from things like this, big pharma, academia, the big corporations, the food industry. All these people benefit from this, right? So they don't want you to know that. They don't want you to know that, you know what? It's really within your own power to determine your mental health. Just like it's within your own power to determine your physical health. It's within your own power to determine your spiritual health. Those things they exist, and they're real because we choose to go down that path. They don't want you to know that. There's a lot of people that are quote unquote suffering from these things, that they don't want you to know that either, because then they have to take accountability and responsibility for what they do. Then the onus is on them. Then it shifts it back to them. See, before these are the people that have an external locus, meaning they believe that most of their life is out of their control and is dependent on people outside of themselves. That's dangerous. Those people are dangerous. Those people are not the people that are going to change anything, because they don't believe that anything can change without the consent of something outside of themselves. And the reality is it's the opposite. Nothing can change until you decide to change. right? So that's the whole point, is that there's people that, one, they're going to take advantage of it, and two, there's people that are going to benefit from it. So you're working against those two things, and I think that's why he got a lot of pushback on his comments. So I think these things are real, but I think they're real because we manifest them, just like everything else. We manifest them, and I think that if you can train yourself through discipline, uh, through doing the work, through understanding your thoughts and understanding your emotions and understanding what's real and what's not real, right? And what's real is what's happening right now. What's not real is the past, because that's only exists as a memory in your brain. What's not real is the future, because we cannot tell the future. But what's real is today. And when you start living in today's terms and start living in reality, in the now, right? Then what happens to us is that we start to predict our own future, because the work we put in today predicts what our future is going to be. But if we're constantly allowing ourselves to look backwards and into the past, and allowing the past to then determine how we act today, then the past becomes the dictator of our future. So tell me what you think. I'm pretty sure there's going to be people that disagree. That's fine. I want to hear it. Comment below. Again, if you like this video, like it. If you don't like it, dislike it. It's fine with me. I want to hear what you got to say. Share it with as many people as possible. And if you've gotten this far and you haven't subscribed, go and hit that subscribe button right now. But until then, my name is Che. This is No Spoon Podcast. Remember, keep breaking curses.